Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Pat Parker. I am the director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities in the College of Arts and Sciences. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here to Hyde Hall for the Mary Stevens Reckford Memorial Lecture in European Studies. I bring you greetings on behalf of Jim White, the Craver Family Dean of the college. Dean White, thank you so much for being here. I also welcome you on behalf of Priscilla Lane, who is the director of the Center for European Studies, who's also a co-sponsor of the Reckford Lecture. So Priscilla, thank you for being here. And Executive Director Katie is here as well. And Dr. Lane is here with her students from her class. I'm delighted to see all the students who've joined us today. I think it's a class on history, the history of medical graphics.
It's graphic medicine.
Oh, graphic medicine.
Illness and disability and graphic novels and comics.
That's right. And so we talked about that at lunch. We had a few students with us at lunch today, and Christine found that intriguing, a connection with some of her talk today. Since speaking of the students who are here, now may be a good time to remind you that you do get campus life experience credit for this, and so be sure to see the QR. Maybe you already have. Get the QR code to make sure you get that credit. But we're just delighted that you're here. So why do we have the Reckford Lecture here? Well, you can read more about the lecture in your program, but and online on our website. But we're just very pleased to be able to offer this lecture annually as a central part of the Institute's commitment to public humanities. Indeed, when it was established in 1990 by Dr. Kenneth J. Reckford, the Kenan Distinguished Professor of Classics, in honor of his late wife, the charge was to appeal to the public rather than specialists. Speakers in European studies are asked to provide, quote, an interdisciplinary approach and a sense of shared humanity. So this year's speaker, Dr. Christine Poggi, whom I will introduce in just a moment, but she certainly exemplifies this charge. Her work focuses on early 20th century European avant-gardes, which of course has long been a topic of public interest. But what is particularly exciting about Christine's work is the ways in which she draws linkages between modern and contemporary art to see, in her words, quote, how issues or ideas may be elaborated or developed over time and across borders in new and surprising ways. Our colleague, Dan Sherman, is Dan here? Yes, Dan is here, yes, all right. So I asked him to give me a few words about how Christine's art has a public appeal, and this is what he had to say, that Christine's work her work shows a great sensitivity to the relationship between art and language. Art as a language of its own, but also in both Futurism and Cubist collage, the subject of her two monographs, which I'll mention in just a moment, its connection to other kinds of language, from poetry to advertising to journalism, and she shares this understanding with her own readers in prose that is always lucid and jargon-free. So before we bring Christine up to the podium, I do have just a few more acknowledgments. I've just mentioned Dr. Dan Sherman, who is also here, I believe, with some of his students. Dan, thank you so much for being a part of our search for this year's lecture. This year's speaker. So Dan is the Limburger Distinguished Professor in the Art and Art History Department. And I believe you and Christine were colleagues at Pennsylvania? Grad school at Yale, yes. So nice to be able to have this small reunion. I think you've had several reunions since you've been here. Also, want to recognize the chair of the Department of Art and Art History, our colleague, Dr. Professor Annette Lawrence. She's the Edna J. Curry Distinguished Professor of Studio Art. Professor Lawrence, nice to see you. Just a couple more. Director, visiting with us here today from the Ackland Art Museum is Director Katie Ziegler. Thank you, Katie. And I believe, is Peter here as well? Yes, Peter is here, Peter Nesbitt, who is Chief Curator at Ackland. And they gave us a wonderful tour of the Ackland. I just want to give you a sense of, this has been a wonderful visit. Christine, she arrived last night, and so we're so pleased to be able to offer this lecture and have our distinguished guests to get a sense of our campus. And so finally, I want to give a special welcome, of course, to the friends and very special guests, Joe and Chalmay Reckford, who are here today. Joe is the son of Kenneth and Mary Reckford, for whom this lecture is named. And of course, the Institute holds the lecture each year around the time of Mary's birthday, which was on February 25th. So we squeaked in just in time on the 29th today, but we're certainly happy to honor the memory of your mother and your father. So thank you so much. So now for the speaker of the hour. And I think I began by saying, welcome to all of you. There are so many people, you're going to shoot me if I keep talking about people to acknowledge, but there's so many friends that are here that I'm just glad to see you. Our former director, John McGowan, is here, and just wanted to acknowledge that, and so happy to see you. And several of our board members are here. But now I will get to our speaker. So, Dr. Poggi is Professor of Fine Arts and the Judy and Michael Steinhardt Director at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. Her research focuses on European avant-garde artists, collage and constructed sculpture, the rise of abstract art, and how art intersects with new and developing forms of labor, technology, and media. She is also interested in the interplay of text and image, the representation of the crowd, and the engagement with theater and performance in modern art form, and the mid-19th century to the present. Her first book, In Defiance of Painting, Cubism, Futurism, and the Invention of Collage, from Yale University Press, examined the invention of the collage form of Picasso and Georges Braque, and how it was then interpreted by Cubists and Futurist artists. Her later publications include Futurism in an anthology, which was published in 2009, and Inventing Futurism, the Art and Politics of Artificial Optimism with Princeton University Press. So we're excited to have her here. She's got some current work that's very exciting, and she'll speak to part of that today, and some other themes that we may get to in the conversation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Poggi.
So I'm going to begin by actually reading this quote because I think it really sets the stage. We don't generally think of Picasso, I don't think, as someone who's deeply invested in the forest and in wood, but there's an early episode in his career when he was very much interested in wood, and I've tried in this talk to figure out what it meant for him prior to Cubism and at the origins of Cubism, and then what happened later. So I just like to read, this is Picasso speaking, in a series of statements that are undated but have been dated more or less to 1917. I experienced my purest emotions in a great Spanish forest where, at 16 years of age, I had withdrawn to paint. I felt my greatest artistic emotions when I suddenly encountered the sublime beauty of sculptures executed by the anonymous artists of Africa. These works of religious art, passionate and rigorously logical, are the most powerful and most beautiful that the human imagination has produced. I hasten to add that, despite this, I detest exoticism. So there's a lot in there, and we'll kind of proceed. Well, let me get here. So Picasso's early forest dwellers emerge from the traces of his memories of the Spanish forest, the shock of his encounter with African and Polynesian sculpture in 1906 and 1907, the many bathers among trees of Paul Cézanne's late work, and the wood carvings of Paul Gauguin. Although the artist would later affirm a freely creative treatment of materials in which anything might be used to signify anything else. In his proto-cubist and early cubist practice, wood takes on a symbolic significance as a purportedly primal material. Indeed, wood has a long history in the West of standing for matter itself, as the etymology of the Greek term hula, and I had to get advice on how to pronounce this, hula, H-Y-L-E, which means wood, matter, that which is disorganized, cannot be counted, and receives form. So to distinguish hula from, and the Latin term materia, which we know means timber, wood, matter, as opposed to mind or spirit. So these two terms give us a sense through their etymology of the long history of thinking of matter through the analogy with wood. In his Physics and other works, Aristotle distinguished between hula and morphe, which is shape, form, or structure, between the fundamental or first matter of all things and the shape or structure it is given by immaterial ideas. According to this so-called hylomorphic model, hula or wood, matter, carries a sense of potentiality as that which receives form from outside of itself, whereas morphe manifests as actualized form. Further, hula refers to the supposedly passive, feminine role of the mother. She becomes the body or vessel, a material substrate, who receives the fully formed homunculus from the active father and merely provides it with nourishment. And this is in Aristotle's view of procreation. The close link between matter and mater, matter, mother, and matrix, retains these associations. Examples of this understanding of wood as a primordial material, as a receptive matrix open to external shaping forces, including the human imagination, can be seen in the German artist Max Ernst's mythologized chance discovery of a technique he called frottage, or in English, just rubbing. As Ernst tells it, one rainy evening on August 10th, 1925, he found himself staring at the floorboards in a seaside inn while in an excited, semi-hallucinatory state. Like Leonardo, who had seen marvelous images in spots on a wall or in flowing streams and in clouds, Ernst began to perceive images in the wood grain that he captured by rubbing black lead onto paper placed directly against the floorboards. This process, as you see in this example here, intensified his vision, according to a statement he made, bringing forth a spontaneous succession of superimposed and contradictory images that he transformed into drawings that revealed the so-called first cause, to use his term, of his obsessive gaze and, quote, produced a simulacrum of that cause. Although Ernst admits to transmuting these images to a significant degree so that the imprint of the floorboards was relatively diminished, he nonetheless poses at the spectator of what he calls the birth of the work, as if the wood and his unconscious had conspired to produce the completed frottage. So he's denying any really, conscious effort. Another example can be found in the German artist Joseph Beuys's Jungfrau Holz, which means virgin, wood, the wooden version, which was a work that was initially conceived in 1958 as a drawing in oil on paper, but that he translated into a teak, originally in 1961. This work, according to the artist, quote, relates to woman and to the female element in general. To express spiritual power and potential, he declared, I tend usually to use the female figure. Now, this is a version that I saw that really stuck with me from the 1979 exhibition that Beuys had at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and I was a curatorial fellow there at the time, and I walked by this every day and kept thinking, really? You know, just was very disturbed, actually. Above the small head of the figure, the artist placed a large square frame that you can maybe see the corner of. Can you see it just beyond there at the far back? A geometric form he associated with masculinity, attributing specific capacities and tendencies to men and women based on their physiology. Beuys further explained that, quote, "This frame represents the balance toward the male, toward that cold, hard, crystallized, burnt-out clinker that I would call the male intellect, the cause of much of our suffering. If you consider male physiology, you will agree that the male is anatomically squarer." This is Beuys. According to this binary schema, the, quote, "female element in general needs to be supplemented with a square sign of male intellect, one that Beuys also sees as emanating from his anatomy. Some balance might be achieved by a partial redistribution or interfusion of attributes, but they remain associated with an essentializing gender binary. As Beuys put it in relation to this work, Virgin, quote, "The square frame is a reminder that she too possesses this intellectualizing potential." He needed to add this reminder because the very structure and materiality of the teak sculpture negates this capacity. In fact, the wooden frame had not been included in the earlier oil study of 1958. To realize the sculptural version of Virgin, Beuys cut down a teak tree in his backyard, creating 9 minimally carved blocks. For an exhibition at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in '79, he laid these blocks horizontally along the ramp as separate elements, with Virgin's legs splayed apart in a manner that signifies sexual availability. Yet the enlarged torso suggests that this Virgin is already impregnated. Beuys's longtime photographer, Uta Klophaus, emphasized this open pose in an image for the exhibition catalog, in which she also captured a young mother pushing a child in a stroller, as if it were the immutable condition of women to be vehicles of procreation. In a similar fashion, Beuys conceived Virgin's horizontality as a permanent state. Composed of disconnected, heavy elements, the figure's legs could not be concerted to rise, and the small head that you can't even see in this photograph by Klophaus does little to suggest thought or voluntary action despite the square frame that Beuys placed above it. Nor does Virgin have arms or hands to enable action or creative expression in the world. Here the equation of wood and primal or ur matter as a feminized, horizontal, passive but fertile matrix finds its exemplary expression. So this is sort of by way of context, letting you know these are not only Picasso's ideas, these are out there. From 1906 to 1908 then, Picasso also seems to have understood wood as a primordial substance associated with the sculptures of Africa and Polynesia, as well as of Romanesque Spain and Northern Europe, and with the forest as an ancient abode for human beings before and forever beyond civilization. Yet by the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, matter had begun to acquire a new definition as a form of energy, as comprising volatile energies and internal forces of its own. Modernist artists often strove to achieve what we now call truth to materials and to preserve the so-called integrity of the medium by allowing its physical characteristics to remain visible through bare patches of canvas or panel, roughly applied brushstrokes and drips of paint, or direct carving in wood. Modernism can be understood as the effort to defeat merely arbitrary inventions by, quote, motivating, this is a term often used, motivating its forms. Often this occurs by allowing the medium to appear to determine a work's shape or structure in an effort to link matter and creative act, body and spirit. To some extent, Picasso's work in the medium of wood registers this tension between wood as unshaped and primal and wood as already bearing within itself particular material characteristics that must be respected or brought forth by the artist's creative process. Picasso arrived in Gozal, a small village in the Spanish Pyrenees, in early June of 1906, and this trip seems to have activated his memories of the Spanish forests and his interest in archaic or primitivizing sculptural forms, as well as in wood as a medium. The artist executed his first woodcuts during the summer of 1906, with crudely drawn marks, carving into his wooden blocks so that they effect a near equation of figure and ground. Bust of a woman with raised hand on the left depicts a young woman with her right hand raised to her shoulder. Bernard Geiser has identified 12 proofs, each colored differently by the artist in oil or gouache, and I didn't bring in the others, but there's a whole set in pink and green and various colors. So the one I've shown here is the one that sort of reads more clearly in blackish brown oil. But he explored, as I say, the possibility of color in various gouache versions. The figure's prominent hand gesture, with only her index and baby finger extended and curled, appears frequently in the artist's works leading up to the two nudes, which we'll see in a moment, that's in MoMA from 1906. This gesture grows out of an earlier series on the subject of Aphrodite rising from the sea and wringing the water out of her hair, or images of women combing their hair. But Picasso began to develop in a very curious way so that it is transformed from a gesture of touching the hair, which has often been associated with female narcissism, into one that begins to evoke inward knowledge, a kind of pointing to the head as if to say there's knowledge, a kind of inly knowledge, as Leo Steinberg would put it. Bust of a woman with raised hand, then, the artist's earliest woodcut, as far as we know, seems only partly committed to its medium, given that the oil paint largely obscures the grain of the wooden block. Later, as you see here on the right, in Bust of a Woman in 3/4 profile, probably executed second in late summer or early fall of 1906, Picasso dispensed with effusive painterly displays of color in favor of sharp contrasts of black and white. Now, I've never seen a version of this from 1906, but there are several from 1933 when he himself printed these with oil paint and gouache in 1933, bringing out another edition. So that's what this one is. This work instantiates a near identity of figure and ground. The image surfaces into visibility only to sink back into its striated matrix. Distinct areas of light and shade seem arbitrarily distributed in defiance of a single source of illumination. A dark shadow engulfs the right side of the woman's neck, which is, of course, to our left, allowing the grain and prominent knot in the fur block to emerge. And I don't know if you see this? This is the grain of the wood, this knot in the wood, and you can see the grain throughout. While her hair falling to our right becomes legible as wood, identical in its linear pattern to the grain of the support, Picasso carved away most of the plane of the face so that it figures to some extent as an absence, but he also left many areas untouched so that, receiving pigment, they read as painterly marks. This produces dark, stain-like smudges that assert the constant presence of the wooden matrix as it permeates the image. And this is in sharp distinction. I have a little section here. Picasso's earlier etchings of 1905 had extremely elegant lines done in dry point, but here we have lines that are thickened, crudely carved, emerging in the midst of all these smudges that signify and bring your attention back to the block. And I also just want to point out the simplification of the face in the features here can also be seen in self-portraits by Picasso, so that this portrait, which seems to be based on his companion at that time, Fernand Olivier, begins to merge with his own face in many of these works. There's a kind of almost gender indeterminacy there. And it also reflects the simplified forms that he could have seen in Iberian sculptures there was an exhibition at the Louvre prior to him leaving for Gozel, Spain. We know he saw that exhibition in the spring of 1906. But those works from ancient Iberia, ancient Spain, were carved in stone. And here he takes the forms, but he translates them into wood, which I take to be significant. So this portrait allows us to see Picasso exploring the potential of the crudely executed woodcut to enhance the primitivizing associations of the figure. Here, medium technique and abstracted forms coalesce to evoke an image of a woman as an avatar of an archaic or even timeless past, emerging as if from a forested environment and still imbued with its primordial materiality. As Robert Rosenblum has noted, Picasso's Summer in Gozel, Spain, quote, prompted many kinds of regression to ethnic and primitive roots. Not only did it stir him a fresh sense of his Spanish origins, but triggered a broader fascination with a remote world unpolluted by modern history. While in Gozel, Picasso also executed his first sculptures out of wood. Josep Palau i Fabrer, the author of a catalogue raisonné on Picasso's work, recalls the artist speaking to him on several occasions of the so-called bois de Gozel. Bois means wood, so the specific wood of Gozel. Quote, this is Palau i Fabrer, that was the name he, that is Picasso, gave to a tree trunk, which apparently he had wanted to give, or help to acquire, a human structure, which he could see prefigured in it. This attempt was also one of his basic concerns at the time, end quote. Drawing on this so-called bois appear also in his Catalan sketchbook from this period. Palau i Fabrer's uncertainty over whether Picasso wanted to endow the tree trunk with form or help it to acquire a human form already prefigured in it is telling. Somehow the artist had both to treat the trunk as primal matter, as unshaped and awaiting his creative intervention, and simultaneously is already imbued with a form that he would merely help to disengage. This form could not stray too far from the shape of the slender boxwood trunk if it were to preserve a sense of its seemingly primordial materiality, and it had to be carved only minimally and roughly in a manner that would reveal the sculpture's continuing identity as a piece of wood. The depicted woman and the boxwood trunk had to seem nearly indistinguishable. Yet Picasso lacked the tools he needed. He repeatedly wrote to his friend, the stone sculptor Enrique Casanovas, who intended to visit him in Gozel, asking him to bring carving implements and paper. In a letter of June 27, 1906, Picasso appealed to Casanovas, quote, I continue working. And this week they brought me a piece of wood, and I'll begin something. Tell me a few days before you come so that I can answer you, because I may want you to bring some chisels to work the wood. He wrote again in July, again, could you bring chisels? But it is unclear that he ever received these because Casanovas never visited. So in the end, he produced two narrow sculptures out of wood. You can see them both here, that he received. In one, the one on the left, or in the middle, he carved the form of a woman with her legs pressed together and arms crossed overhead within a smoothed out columnar shape that betrays its rough originary matrix at the top and the bottom. And can you make out her form? Oh, what just happened? Let me see if I can do this. So here's her face, arms crossed overhead, breasts, legs pressed together. And you can see that she's just incised, and then it's very rough up here, right? But she's just incised into this wood. So the gesture of the arms held overhead to form, I think, is making an appearance here. It's also in many drawings and some paintings. I think it's very significant at this period. You may be familiar with the gesture of the odalisque, or the seductive figure with one arm overhead, whether horizontally displayed or in vertical form, which has been called the pose of seduction. I think it's important that Picasso clearly knew that, he'd used it, but this is a very different pose. And what I would like to suggest is that here, this gesture, with the arms held over the head, forms a kind of archway that constitutes within the body itself the corporeal sign of a threshold, one that the figure both assumes and is poised to cross. So I just want to show you, he does a whole series of these works where the figure is crossing their arms. This is not a pose of seduction. I think it's something rather different. And you, so I think, and then you can see the figure on the left. There are female figures as well, either posed within curtains or under an archway. And that passage from behind the curtain or through the archway to the other side is a metaphor for a sexual passage, the before and after of a sexual encounter, of kind of primal virginal innocence and sexual knowledge. And this is how he, I think, is trying to conceive and write it in the body, to create the body as a corporeal sign of that passage. So, based on looking at many of these, I've come to that conclusion, and it's hypothetical. So in moving through this liminal space in several drawings, Picasso thought he could make the body itself signify the passage, the psychic and physical transformation through bodily posture alone. So eventually you don't need to have the curtain or the archway. The body can assume this posture, and we can read it, I think, as that sign of sexual and psychic transition. In the other boxwood sculpture, here on the far right, Picasso hacked away at the wood so that it portrays the slightly tilted shape of a woman, head at the very top, with both arms cleaving tightly to her torso. Her right arm, which is on our left, runs along the length of her side, and her left arm bends to raise a hand to her shoulder. The artist gave greater definition to the head and the features, which recall those of his companion Fernand Olivier, although the head rests on a thickened, crudely hewn neck. And there are traces of paint that suggest that maybe, there's a sense of ruin here, that maybe it had more paint. There's just a few traces suggesting that it has undergone some ravages of time. Significantly, both works treat the body as a single unified shape without gaps or projecting limbs that would break the uniformity and solidity of the whole. In the second sculpture, the one on the far right here, the woman who emerges from the wood does not have distinct legs and feet to carry her weight. Moreover, neither of these works has a supporting base. This anti-classical posing of bodies that do not meet the ground in a graceful, convincingly naturalistic way presents them rather as objects to be held in the hand in any position or mounted on an external structure. This precarity enhances the sense that the sculptural object should be apprehended through both vision and touch as an object that continues to be a piece of wood. Whether consciously or not, the artist gave these columnar sculptures a distinctly phallic shape, one that Sigmund Freud would argue in his essay Fetishism of 1927 reveals an act of disavowal of the unwelcome discovery by the little boy that a woman does not have a penis. Believing that she must have had one and has lost it, he fears for his own bodily integrity. Right? This is famous Freud, and he wrote it up in 27, but there are already mentions of this as early as 1905. Seen in this light, the self-sealing phallic bodies of these women function as fetishistic objects that oscillate between male and female attributes. The nude's entire body potentially standing in for the missing penis, but also covering over her supposed lack. In making this observation, I do not intend to suggest that Picasso was familiar with Freud's theories, but simply that they both drew from contemporary notions that located psychic phenomena in bodily experience and childhood traumas, and that Picasso, like Freud, was not afraid to ponder questions of sexual identity, masculine fear of sexual difference, the fluidity of infantile desire, and the ambiguous relation of desire to human morphology. So I just brought those in. Thought I had. Let me just see something here. Oh. No, never mind. Sorry, getting a little confused. A similar, sorry, this is a little out of order somehow. So a similar desire to unify the female body, smoothing over and emphasizing the continuity of its curves and thickening the neck so that head, neck, torso, and legs become more tightly joined in a simplified, abstracted, and columnar shape occurs in numerous drawings of this period. And I'm only showing you now nude girl walking here on the left. I hope you can see it well enough. He had drawn with more descriptive curves the shape of this young girl's body, and then he goes over them with a line that kind of obliterates those in favor of continuous arcs, just eliminating any nuance. So he's schematizing her shape while also denying the extension of her right shoulder into depth and rendering her face in a mask-like way. So I only brought in one, but there are many of these where you see him drawing something in a more naturalistic way and then abstracting it, schematizing it, and creating a more columnar closed shape. So somehow I got these slightly out of order. Sorry about that. Such departures from naturalism reveal Picasso's growing interest in a primitivized, and I use that word with big quotes around it, female body sometimes rendered analogous to a trunk of wood in its columnar self-containment and unbreached wholeness. Leo Steinberg famously interpreted the bodies of the women in two nudes of 1906 that you see here on the left, which he reads, and I think convincingly, as the work that precedes the very explosive Demoiselle d'Avignon. Both of these works are in MoMA. So this is the before and after in temporal sequence. Two women in the antechamber of the brothel getting ready to go through the curtain, and that's what happens when they get on the other side of the curtain. So he interpreted the bodies of the two nudes as signifying their raw materiality and virginity by recourse to the analogy with what he calls, quote, carved logs. Whereas the figures in the Demoiselle, a brothel scene on the right, stare down their male clients in what he calls, quote, a clash of the sexes and a moment of reciprocal shock in an implicitly shared space. So he's including the implied male viewer in this shock of reciprocal shock, really. Picasso set the two nudes in a female-only antechamber, a space of anticipation, and what Steinberg calls a condition of women alone. He calls attention to the change in body types as the women move through the depicted curtain from the antechamber in two nudes to the scene of sexual confrontation in the Demoiselle. And now I'm going to quote Steinberg on this. In the earlier painting, The Two Nudes, a pair of crude, sturdy maidens stand like carved logs, timber, lately enwomaned and sold. They are forms intact, their humanity sealed in integuments of solid fusion. As sculptured monoliths, they suggest matter, never yet plied or stretched. As creatures of growth, they appear raw and unbreached. As physiological types, they seem unadapted and unaccustomed to motion, with flesh that has never admitted to pressure, bodies then of primal virginity. That's Steinberg. One can further note that in one of the studies for the two nudes, and let me see if I can get back to, on the right, you can see that little gesture of the fingers, right, that were in that earlier work. But there's another one. That gesture keeps recurring, and eventually we get the one in the two nudes on the left where it turns into that one figure pointing to head as a form of self-reflection and knowledge. So I just wanted you to see that transition. All right, so let me now go to these works. So explorations of a similarly, and I use this word primitivized in its early 20th century kind of mythologized context. A series of these male figures were also taking shape. In spring of 1908, during a time when Picasso was haunting the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro to view its collection of African art, he executed a little analyzed series of male heads on wooden panels of identical size. These works present heads that appear as if chiseled out of wood in extreme close-up. The heads bend forward into the viewer's space, or they tilt upward as if to catch a light they cannot see, but simultaneously withdraw from the viewer with closed or averted eyes. So you have one of these figures on the far left there. In Head of a Man, the male head settles directly on abstracted, straight-edged shoulders. Picasso having dispensed with the inconvenience of a supporting neck that he had a lot of trouble with. He either had to get rid of it or thicken it. It couldn't be just an anatomically transitional element. So this posture emphasizes the strict, even hieratic frontality and rectilinear symmetry of the figure, invoking African and Egyptian religious prototypes. The man sits on a plain wooden chair whose back appears just behind his head, in tones that echo those of his head. Schematic eyes rendered in black lines with a gray-blue wash deny access to his gaze, while a sharply articulated curve divides light from dark, enumerating the lower part of his face. Simple geometries and elemental forms prevail over nuanced transitions, creating echoes across the visage while avoiding signs of individuality. The wedge-like triangular shapes in the hair of the painted man are apparently inspired by those motifs at the top of a crew mask that was in the collection of the Trocadero. What I brought you here was a slide I happened to have. It was easier for me to get really quickly, but this is one he acquired later in 1912. He purchased this crew mask, but there was one he clearly saw at the Trocadero, which has this triangular formation across the brow, and he borrows that for the head of his figure here. So many of the features of that head do relate to African motifs, especially the shape of the mouth and the wedge-like nose. So he rendered the figure in colors that seem to evoke wood. And they're painted on wood. You know, he seems to be really trying to get into that motif. He endowed another male head, this time seen in profile on the left, tilted upwards, with a closed eye, sharply rendered wedge-like nose, and strange almond-shaped ear. The curvature of the hairline suggests this may be a fantasized self-portrait, one in which Picasso strove to imagine himself as quote-unquote other, as able to assume an alien identity or project an image of himself as a so-called primitive. So he, you know, in a way it's arrogant to assume he can project himself, but maybe he's genuinely trying to, it's hard to know exactly what to think of this. Previously, he'd imagined himself as a harlequin. Later, he would take on alter egos as a minotaur and as a bull. Again, we have these chiseled, very hard planes, the kind of abstraction in the face. I won't give too much by way of a description since these are rather similar. This one I couldn't find color photograph, but all of these mostly gouache, sometimes oil, executed on wood. I think it's significant that every work in the series, the eyes are crossed out or obscured so that the figure is definitively shown as not able to look outside. So the gaze is inward. And there's also the idea that in the forest there is no light, there's no clearing, it's in the shadow. The clearing comes with the Enlightenment. It comes with reason and law. But supposedly in the forest, this is all mythology, they can't see. So that's what I think we have here. Some of these heads are closely related to studies on paper that imagine figures either in interiors or in forest settings. So if you trace Head of a Man there on the left, you can see its relationship to a sequence of these works. The one in the center seems to be very similar. Now you get the rectilinear form of the chest. And then another work as a drawing in which the artist adds chest hair, pubic hair, and eyelashes. Initially thought of this as a way of sort of desublimating the figure, giving it bodily hair because the shape is so abstracted. But in effect, I've come to think of it now, the squarishness of the torso as one sign of masculinity if we think about boys, and then the exposed genitals as a sign of virility and masculine power. So in a way, they're just two different ways of signifying an intensified form of energy, contained energy, but also masculinity, both in the abstraction of the body, the torso, and in the legs. And then he puts these figures into the forest. So you see the relationship here in the work. Let's see, the one on the left, he takes the same figure and he places it now in the woods. He had previously been sitting on some kind of box or chair, and now he's sitting on a log. And again, the gaze is down, the arms are crossed in a gesture of, I think, self-sealing, refusal, creating a kind of tension that's to some extent contrasting with the open legs in the sense of exposure and availability. So all of these works, and the female ones too, have this kind of tension or ambiguity between refusal, self-sealing, self-protection on the one hand, and availability and desire and openness to experience on the other. And they're fused through bodily gesture, pose, and the setting. And then the figure in the center, I couldn't get a very good color image of this just yet. But in this figure, I think, it's interesting for the intrusion of color. And I really pondered this for a long time. What is all that blue ink doing there? And this is highly speculative here. We see the same man twice. Hard to know, but the intense blue coloring that pervades the faces and part of the background could be read as evocations of sky or water in the forest. It's as if these men, or perhaps one man twice, were made out of the elements that surround him, in particular earth, sky, and or water. And one of the ideas that has often been associated with the forest, this primordial realm, is that since matter is in this inchoate state, has not yet been shaped, that all the elements can be transformed into each other. So water, wood, sky, earth, this can all be kind of blended together. And because it lies outside the realm of the polis or the city, it's not subject to laws, norms, language, shape, or form. So matter can kind of engage in this process of metamorphosis. And I also just want to call your attention to the word forest, which I was interested to learn in Latin comes from foris, which simply means outside, fuori in Italian, outside, that which is outside the law, civilization. Of course, it's a projected myth produced by civilization. And it's possible, of course, that this man is simply a bather, but if he doesn't have any water to bathe in, he might be part of a series that we think Picasso was planning to do a series of men. He had done a series of female bathers that you see on the right here. Maybe he was planning to do one of men, but he never got around to it. So we can trace a similar movement from the interior environment to forest scenes in a sequence of female figures from the spring of 1908. Same time as these male figures. So we have several heads rendered in gouache on wood that explore the same formal vocabulary in the male heads. In Head of a Woman on the left, a gouache on wood, it's the same exact size as a series of male heads. Picasso defined the figure's visage and falling hair through a series of elemental, abstracted, and reconfigured shapes. And I would just call your attention to the falling hair on the right side, our right, of this figure, which seems to echo the shape of the neck, but that's not a naturalistic flow of hair, this sudden kind of bend. So it seems to be a way of thickening the neck once again. In many of these figures, you can see a more naturally inclined or slender neck, and then he just adds a whole section to thicken it up and make it a more columnar shape. He indicates the mouth through some very hastily rendered marks and shears off part of the chin. The implausible angle of the hair, as I said, seems to function to restate and thicken the neck. And you can see that there is a forest rendered in green and brown hues that surrounds the woman. And if you could look at it really closely, you can see striated lines that continue from that forest right onto her face. Just these lines as if, the wood grain was permeating all of it and casting its color onto her as well. So this Head of a Woman seems to be closely related to a series leading up to Nude in the Forest. You can see one of the studies here on the right, two figures. In this one, the foreground figure strides very aggressively toward the viewer, her legs apart in a rather brazen anti-classical pose. Her left arm descends in, which is on our right, in broken faceted volumes to a clenched fist, signifying refusal. I hope you can see that. And there are studies where you see Picasso trying to figure out how he's going to do this clenched fist. And he does it so that the fingers can signify this way or that way. You see him making it so you can't see the thumb. So, it's a very tense, and I would argue in his vocabulary, more masculine, geometricized vocabulary was on the right side. You have a swerve more continuous from the shoulder down through the open hand, signifying a kind of invitation. So you have that refusal and invitation on alternate sides of the figure. But it wasn't enough to, to create this kind of tension between the ambivalence of desire and fear, or sexual aggression and refusal. When this work assumed its final monumental shape, the nude in the forest on the far right, you can see that Picasso, he switched right and left legs as well. And according to Leo Steinberg, that is a clear sign of a kind of intermixing or interfusion of masculine and feminine, that within Western culture, the right hand is male, the left is female. Everything gets gendered. And so when you switch something, you're creating some cross traffic there that's a little deliberate as he sees it. But there's, and you also see that this figure was originally understood as a kind of harlot in a brothel with her legs splayed, sitting in a chair. Then she gets put in the forest and then here. But that sort of relaxed, open-legged pose where she can probably barely stand up gets transmuted into the forest scene. So he's trying to create that sense of some kind of sexuality that is kind of pre-civilization, I guess. But we also have the fact that, what I would argue a tendency toward more geometric form in the refusal, in the aggressive side of the figure, which I could show you more studies, but you can see a kind of interesting transmutation also in this figure on the right, where in this forest realm, not only do male and female begin to kind of cross traffic in terms of some of their attributes in a single figure, but this figure on the right, as Steinberg did point out, begins to develop on the reserve side of her leg behind her knee an animal hawk. So she's also turning it kind of quasi into an animal. And so this quasi transformation, the fluidity between different forms of matter, earth, sea, water, wood, but also animal, human and male and female, all within the forest, these kinds of transformations are supposedly possible. Steinberg writes that Picasso conceived his atavistic dryads in this manner. He writes of nude with raised arms, quote, that she is, quote, a jungle dweller in slumberous vitality. She walks alone, listening to the surge of the body as her left leg metamorphoses into the hind leg of a quadruped, a hawk on the reserve side of her knee. So if we accept this view, we may further interpret that many of Picasso's male and female figures of this period close their eyes because they are also, quote, to use Steinberg's term, listening to the surge of the body, a force that becomes audible through the unconscious rather than through engagement with the external world. So it's trying to understand the feeling of desire that's supposedly emerging at that time. Let me move now to this work. This work was really at the basis of many of the speculations in this talk. This work was acquired through the Leonard A. Lauder donation to the Metropolitan Museum, and they had a whole little mini symposium about it, and I had a chance to look at it closely at that time. And I couldn't help but notice that there seems to be something like a twig growing out of this woman's backside. You see this little, and there's a fainter one up here. And that this is a tree. I mean, this is a figure nestled within the angle of a tree in a forest. And I just began to think about the wood, the fact that it's very loosely painted on the outside, the surround, but the forms of the figure herself look rather different, as if they have been chiseled. And she's kind of as if he's chiseling her into existence out of the wood like he had done with those earlier sculptures. So, just very curious about this little twig, started thinking about it. I noticed, and everyone else noticed, that this head looks an awful lot like an Easter Island head. And there was one really wonderful talk where a gentleman who's, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name now, I can find out. But he read in an account of this period by Fernand Olivier that they used to go and haunt the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, where Picasso was particularly fascinated by that Easter Island head that you can see in the back of the photo in the middle there, the Easter Island head was on view at the Jardin des Plantes. Here you see some of them. And he imposed this face over this figure. As far as I know, it's the only instance of use of an Easter Island head. But again, these heads are made out of volcanic stone, and Picasso, in transforming it, put her into a forest and made her look chiseled. So, perhaps she's also listening to the surge of the body. Is she partly attached to that tree trunk? Is she are we to understand the little twig as signifying that she's even maybe still living wood with a little twig growing out of her backside? Like, is this what we're learning? And then given that I really do think that Picasso treats the body as a potential sign system in and of itself through gesture, I pondered the weird pose that she seems to be assuming there on the, and I finally came to the decision, and you may all disagree, that is a yonic pose, that, it's signifying her female anatomy. If you look at it closely, you can see that her right thigh has been cut off. It doesn't continue past her arm. So it just there's an elision there. There's no continuation of the thigh. Her breasts have been pushed so far up, and her elbows are out, making a kind of diamond shape. And that he's done everything he can to create some open space in there, to create a kind of open diamond right above her crotch, so that we have a restatement through her arms and hand gesture of her female anatomy, her sexual anatomy, as if restating that biological potential that she supposedly has. And I just wanted to show you another image. This is Cézanne's Eternal Feminine, where you see again this idea of the yonic, the kind of vulva form as the framing element to talk about the quote-unquote eternal feminine. So it's not only Picasso that thought that maybe he could signify that through a kind of framing, but I think Picasso, I believe, does it through the gesture of the arms. But this work I see is now, upon further reflection, is a kind of turning point. Got my eye on the cloud. So she displays, I think, the tensions and the ambiguities of this entire project. Because even as he presents her as an avatar of a feminized, so-called primitive or primordial matter, he also endows her with the capacity for inner self-awareness and reflection. She is made out of wood, seemingly, indeed wood that might still be alive, but insofar as she is chiseled and has a head that quotes an Easter Island prototype, she also has a known historical lineage, and she's partly a work of art, right? So, and maybe those two small gray twigs attached to her backside are no longer living and signify her separation from the living matrix of the tree. They're beginning to look a little dead. So she also, we can note, dissimulates her actual medium, which is oil painting, not primitive wood carving. So although she assumes a yonic posture as if to re-signify her feminine anatomy and to make it visible in the form of a corporeal hieroglyph, she seems rather uncomfortable doing so. This is an awkward, unconvincing pose that has to be asserted against nature, even in defiance of nature. And it's a fiction, this pose, that makes an ambiguous statement, one that I now posit Picasso had begun to doubt. Like his contemporary Freud, to bring him in again, he had probably, he had many, many gay friends to one possible. What is the relationship that Freud was pondering, but I think Picasso as well? What is the relationship of anatomy to desire? Can you read desire just from someone's body and their appearance? Or is desire to be understood as a psychic force impinging from within? And then if it is, how do you figure it in art? That becomes a very difficult problem. So now I'd like to move ahead to the second part, and I might abbreviate some of this for lack of time, I think. But so then he begins to work with George Braque, moves toward analytical cubism, issues around wood and this kind of idea of the forest as an atavistic environment, and a longing for this point of origin, this place where you could go and outside of the law, outside of civilization. That seems to recede, and they begin to work more to challenge the norms of conventional representation as such. So I'll just show you two works quickly to set the stage. One is a still life with chair caning on the right, in which you have a piece of oilcloth printed, mechanically printed with chair caning, which is the most illusionistic element in the work, but it's made by machine. The artist will not deign to do that kind of work. That's not what the artist wants to do. It's a more conceptual play. Also creating a rote frame that he got from an artisan, a sailor. He didn't make it itself. So using cheaper substitutes for what would have been high art craft or fine art materials. And then here's Braque, who was the first one to appropriate mechanically printed wallpaper to signify wood grain in a series of works that then his papier-collé and collages use this manufactured material to signify the wood paneling on the back of the wall, probably also the drawer in the front of what is then here a still life table. So just to say that they began to work together, and I'm kind of skipping over a few years because really wood played no role. In 1910, 1911, it's just gone. Whoops. And then it reappears in the form of trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye, wood grain, executed in some quick and easy way, usually, not requiring high levels of skill. So one of the ways they did this by taking the painter's comb and dragging it through wet paint. That was a trick that George Braque had learned from his father and grandfather, who were house decorators. And so Picasso does that to create the wood grain on the left of this collage. But as you can see, it's only one element among many. It's not really concerted here to fool anybody. It's episodic. You have a piece of trompe-l'oeil in the midst of something that the rest of which is not. And it gives you the left profile of the guitar. It's already disrupting. He does this often. The upper curve is bigger than the lower one when it should be the reverse. So he's always going to throw a wrench into everything. And then the profile on the right is given to you by two stacked elements, which create a kind of straight-edged double curve, or an equivalent of a double curve on the right. And you've got the contrast of hand drawing one of his own cubist glasses, the wood grain created with the comb, the wallpaper, the musical score. He's putting all these elements in, constructing a guitar out of a variety of elements that never really treat wood as something substantive or primordial. It's manufactured, it's cheap, it's just one of many elements. This is an amazing work that I saw in the Cubism and Trompe-l'oeil exhibition that was at the Met about a year and a half ago. And in this work, if you look at the way he executes trompe-l'oeil here, it's really masterfully clever, always with a view to telling you this is not wood. Always just, this is trompe-l'oeil that says, and I'm not wood. So you can see at the upper left this violin. If you look at that trompe-l'oeil, it's very painterly. You can see the paint just sort of melding into the ground, softening. Then you get part of the lower profile of the guitar that you see here. The violin with the reddish color suddenly emerging, so we don't have consistent local color. We go from lighter brown to this darker red. And in this detail, which I really, hard to see it over here, but I view this as one consistent element that's both the bottom of the table and the bottom profile of the guitar. And here, it's straight wood grain, vertically aligned, a little gap, and then wavy. See the little gap here? So straight, gap, wavy, and then when you continue on the right, it's horizontal. He's just, if you look closely, he's telling you, this is not wood, this is paint. And then it blurs into the ground. So I think he's having a lot of fun with pointing out that the wood grain here it's superficial, it's sheer, it's something he's going to have fun with and get you to engage, but there's just no primordial associations. Just a couple more. This one by Braque, called Violin. It was in the exhibition where they listed it with the usual description of bits of sand and metal shavings, and then they looked at it. No, those are wood particles, which are imitating wood. It's sawdust and wood particles, which are put on the surface in imitation of collage elements. There's no collage here, there's no pasted paper at all. They're into discrete little shapes. And if you look at them, it's wood representing a collage element representing wood, but actually is wood, but not in the shape or form that we would normally. So they're beginning to do a kind of metacritique of these materials. And then just two more. This one of my favorites that I saw for years in the Philadelphia Museum of Art when I was teaching there, and I at the time was very fascinated by the fact that here Picasso had painted fake wood grain tabletop onto a wooden support. Sort of re-signifying wood through the wood grain on top of the wood. And then the border at the bottom is an imitation in paint of wallpaper border that he owned that wallpaper and used in certain collages. Here he's painting an imitation of the wallpaper that mimics a carved wooden frame. And then I don't know if he chose that frame, but it kind of has a similar pattern, so that the bottom edge of the table is also to be understood as potentially the bottom or the frame of the picture itself. So those were all fun things to point out to the students, but as I looked at it again, I noticed on the right, the wood grain table itself is more complicated than I had seen. He drags the comb through the paint horizontally, more or less straight edged. And then he goes over it again with a wavy pattern. You know, so you have the wood grain in these two conflicting imbricated patterns. And I just think we don't look hard enough, but there's lots of little clever things in these works that tell you this is not wood. And finally, I get to my conclusion. I kind of leaped ahead a little bit. This is a work that I was very taken by years ago. It was in the Picasso Sculpture Show, and I looked at it a long time, and I thought, well, here it is. It's a box, very masculine. So many years later, in 1958, he executed a new head of a man out of a mass-produced rectilinear sculpture, a simple open wooden box or crate mounted on an overturned ceramic dish for a base. Picasso attached a narrow angled strip of wood, probably cut from the lid of the box to its top edge. It represents the plane of the face and nose with two buttons for eyes. Just below this plane, a strange, unshaped mass of plaster and resin supports a small horizontal piece of wood that stands for the mouth. So I hope you can see this kind of wobbly structure in there with these elements sticking out. So here is a man's head created out of simple prefabricated and cut elements that create a system of familiar signs made of unlikely, geometric, and form-defying elements. I take it to be an ironic self-portrait of the artist. Thank you very much.
How did you come to do art?
To
To be an artist, to do art history and to get into this field?
You know, it's very, when I look back, it feels all predetermined. At the time, I certainly didn't know that, but my mother's an artist. My mother is an artist, and everybody in her family in Italy seems to have not unbelievable artistic talent, but some, and they all are somehow involved in art one way or the other. And she was always taking painting classes, and she would take me with her, and I would sit on the floor, and I would have my paints, and she'd be painting on it, I'd be painting on the floor. And we had art books all over the house. There were paintings. She did metal welding. There was all kinds of work all over the house and art books everywhere. So I think that was an influence. But I can remember certain specific things. I remember going to the Louvre when I was about to turn 12, and my brother and I were just playing tag. We were running around, and my parents were trying to look at a few things. And we came through the Byzantine galleries. And, I'm certainly not a specialist in Byzantine art at all, but there were all these golden frames and these kind of powerful faces coming out. And I remember thinking to myself, even at that age, I want to know about this. What is this stuff? So I had a number of these kinds of experiences until I finally realized, I guess this is it. Yeah.
So your approach to your topic, as Dan sort of reminded us, is very, well, you didn't say this, but I'll use it. It's very intimate, and it's very intricate, and especially as his language is, and the way that you. So I'm curious about your topic, the title of your lecture, from primal matter to surrogate veneer, wood and faubois in Picasso's Cubism. So can you talk a bit, just sort of step back and sort of frame, what's the language that, what did you walk us through in that, in your talk today, in terms of if you were thinking about his use, if you were to sum up sort of that what he was trying to communicate through wood. That may be too general. I don't know. And listen, get your questions ready. This is my
I think-
best attempt at getting
Well, I think
into
there
this.
are various threads that came
Yeah.
together. One of them, and I don't think I was aware of this until you were asking me about this earlier today, but there is a famous painting by Boccioni, the Italian artist Boccioni, called Materia, Matter. And I wrote about it, and it's an image of his mother. And I thought, well, why is he calling his mother? It's a painting of his mother, but he calls her Matter. And I began to think about why would he, what's the relationship between the mother and matter? And of course, in Italian, it's kind of obvious. But then I did a little work around that, and I thought, and I'm not really sure, but different elements came together. When I saw that work in the Met with the little twig growing out of the backside, I thought, what's going on with that? Why is she nestled in a tree? Why does she have an Easter Island head? This is very strange. What's that posture? I can't figure out that posture. And it kind of bothered me. So I think, and then I got interested in Picasso's early work and thinking about gender for a different talk, in which he superimposes his own portrait onto that of Gertrude Stein. And I just started thinking, he's completely fusing his face with Gertrude Stein's. What's that all about? That kind of gender confusion there or interfusion. And so thinking, oh, well, he's doing more things with gender than I would have thought. They're more exploratory than I had realized. So then these little insights kind of made me think more about it.
I think there are questions. Okay.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I want to ask about the positioning of the viewer. So, one of the ways I responded to the images you were showing is, traditionally portraiture is supposed to reveal the soul of the person who's being portrayed. And I felt like these portraits were repulsing me. They were, in fact, kind of teasing me with the fact they weren't going to reveal anything. So I was just curious about thinking about, you use terms like aggressive in relation to Picasso's, aggressiveness towards the viewer.
I think he is often aggressive toward the viewer. He's famous for having said in 1912, when he began using commercial enamel paint in certain works, and one of his dealers, Uda, said to him, so-and-so doesn't like your work anymore with enamel. And he said, good, soon we'll discuss the entire world. So, he was willing to let the chips fall where they might. Most of these works were never sold. Many of them stayed in his possession, so I don't think they appealed to a lot of people. And they were probably, to some extent, a private exploration of these ideas. But there were enough people who liked them and were interested. People like Gertrude Stein, in fact, collected his sketchbooks and some of these works. So there were always enough people around. There was a dealer named Sergei Shukin who would come from Russia periodically. Kahnweiler, his dealer, would say to Shukin, he'd send him a telegram, he's done some new work. And Shukin would come. And he collected some of those really strange heads. The head of the woman. When I first saw it in black and white, I thought it was just awful. Then when I saw it in color, I actually thought it was beautiful, weirdly, because I've been looking at these for, you start to see more, and I don't think they're intended to be attractive, and I don't think they're persons, as we would say, like they're not portraits of individuals, so-and-so, that you want to reveal something about that specific individual. These are, I think, more abstracted notions of human subjects that if they're in the forest, they're hardly quite fully human yet. Or at least he's hoping to get at some originary state of being, and they're not really people who are known people. It's not a person that he knows.
Chris, thanks very much for that talk. I'm going to ask maybe an obvious question, but so what happens to bring wood back? You mentioned the absence from between 1908. In the the really intense beginnings of what would later be called analytical cubism. And it seems like wood is something very different when we get it in the collage, in the papier collé and the collage. So what do you think is the significance of its return in that different form?
That was one of the key questions that I was kind of struggling with, and I have come to the provisional conclusion that it's really his increased awareness of African art. There are hints of his understanding that African art is very different in conception than Western art, where in the Western tradition you tend to think of human anatomy as having an interior skeletal form and musculature that determines what's on the outside. And that's why students in classical schools, they study anatomy. But it seems that African artists treat their works much more freely and conceptually. It doesn't have to look like an analog of something. It just has to signify that thing in a powerful way. So he starts to bring ears, even in 1907, he'll bring an ear so it touches the eye, which is something he might have seen in some African work. So the features of a face can be disposed in any way in an African mask, and I think he's really interested in that, and he starts to think about freedom from anatomical analogs. You don't have to imitate directly what it looks like to us Westerners. And then once you think of form as a sign system, which I think he does through Cubism, because he starts to do things like, he's interested in perspective. Okay, perspective is one of these things that in the West helps us to create the illusion of space. And we all know, train tracks seem to converge as they get farther away. So he reverses it. He makes them converge toward you, the viewer. He takes on every conceivable trick that Westerners use to create a sense of 3D, and he reverses it, does it episodically, puts shadows in the wrong place. I mean, he's trying to deconstruct this language. And I think it made him think of the way we represent the world as a system of conventions. No one way is right. No one way is truer than another way. These are all conventions that we've agreed on, but it's more interesting to him to disrespect them in a way, if you want to, or create something else. And I think African art was very essential in giving him a kind of model and catalyst to think differently. And he had been collecting it, but then in 1912 he purchases that mask that I showed you. And he later said it was the catalyst for the paper guitar that he constructed, where he has a sound hole that projects out instead of going in. He said that's what they would have done, that's the kind of thing they would have done. So he likes the idea of reversals, and he sees it in African art. He sees the freedom. And I think that gave him this catalyst. But it's probably more complex than that, but over time. And then there's a kind of meta-critique in Cubism where you critique your own critique, or you make fun of it. You create something out of paint that looks like a collage. When they start doing that, at this point, he's just having too much fun, I think. I don't know. There may be more to it.
In your first slide, you had the quote from Picasso, and it ended with this something like, I deplore exoticism. What do you think Picasso meant? Not by what do you think he understood exoticism to be? So that's one question, and I will give you a bit of context for my question in that in some of the images, sometimes when I think about exoticism, I think about the gaze. And so it's really interesting when you talked about the fact that some of the figures had so the gaze, it was almost like the gaze was interior. And that made me think about Black interiority. So in other words, to the extent to which one could reflect on notions of freedom or whatever in terms of thinking about that. So I'm just going to put all of those things together and throw them at you as a question.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, these are things that I've also thought about. I don't really know what he meant by exoticism in 1917. It could be that certain forms of exoticism, I think he was moving away from the Gauguin version of exoticism, the idea that you could go to Polynesia and run around and pretend to be a Polynesian or something. I think he started to, at least by 1917. So I think there's a progressive move away from that, and he starts describing African art more and more as logical, which seems to be this way of refuting kind of more intuitive kind of, oh, it's strange, or no, it's the most logical, it's the most beautiful, it's the most powerful. So, but he always emphasizes reason. They have a reason for putting these things where they do. That's just not an analog of what we Westerners might think. So I think that's part of it. But he's not consistent. Sometimes he does sound like he's interested in the exoticism of it. And then about the gaze, I think many of these works, the gaze is blocked. So on the one hand, you might think that the figure is directed inward. They're thinking, they're feeling, they're trying to listen to this surge of feeling, supposedly as a psychic event. But it may, I think sometimes there's a sense of mystery too. And it might be a way of acknowledging, you think you can look at someone in the eye and know what they're experiencing and connect with them, but there's something unknowable about the other and even about the self. So in some of the works where the eye is so obliterated, so the whole half of the face is obliterated in some works, I think he's even talking about the unknowability of the self to the self. Like, you don't fully understand what your unconscious might be giving forth, and there's a sense of opacity that can't just be penetrated or here's who you are. There's something more mysterious. So those are just some thoughts on that.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you very much. I was really intrigued by the later works you were showing where he was like signifying wood, right, but not actually using wood. And I was wondering if what you see as motivating that shift in his work, if there's any like connection to the socio-political context. It made me think of Marguerite and like, this is not a pipe, right?
I thought of that too when I was
So I was wondering, is he kind of engaging with the notion that like, you can't believe your eyes, which might connect to the political climate of the time?
I think it would be a little bit indirect because one of the things he's clearly responding to is the rise of mass production and mechanical forms of production, which are making craft labor and hand labor more and more obsolete. And so you do have him exploring all what we now call de-skilled forms of labor, which are becoming the norm, right? The industry is taking away craft skills from people and making them do work in factories that is lower skilled and then therefore less well paid. And instead of having a beautiful wooden panel in your house, you're going to have this wallpaper. Or maybe you just drag the comb. So, and part of it is the rise of photography too. So I think there's a certain challenge that many artists experienced in that their craft where you grind your paints, you paint with oil, you have the canvas, and all these things start to seem kind of obsolete when that kind of craft labor is just not the norm anymore. So I think there's a kind of reflection on, we have all these surrogate materials that we use all the time. Should art somehow not engage that? And he's got a real sense of irony, so he's going to engage it. And sometimes he'll fake it, right? It looks like a fake thing, but I actually painted it. But, so I think it's a quest to give the artist importance in some way by making the work more imaginative and conceptual rather than craft-based, at a time when craft itself has been so debased. So if craft is already debased, I'm going to be a conceptual worker. I'm not going to compete with the photograph. I'm not going to, why should I paint wood grain if I can just, I'm not going to do that. So I think there's a lot around technology and labor that is motivating it, the ubiquity of all these cheap substitutes. I read this amazing book by Robert Pogue Harrison, who talks about the literal destruction of forests, and especially in Germany, where there was even more mythology and importance of the forest, but then the state wanted to regulate the forest. And all of a sudden the forest, instead of being the outside and this thing that the state was sort of inside over here and supposedly this forest is, they start regulating the forest itself and thinking of it not in terms of origins and a kind of refuge or a place to escape civilization. But in terms of productivity, how much wood can we get out of this forest? Can we make a profit from this forest? And you think now about even greenhouse gases are calculated in terms of number of trees that are in certain places, and that you have to preserve a certain amount of forest if you're going to have noxious gases over here. We don't think of the forest very much anymore in terms of, I mean, there are certain parks, but the forest has been so thoroughly cultivated and in a way destroyed, right, by civilization itself, that maybe there's some sense of the mythology of the forest as being eroded by industry going into these forests and cutting down trees, and that you can hardly say that we live in the city and the forest is out there. That probably came to seem less convincing.
Well, I think that that will have to be the last word. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture and discussion. And thank you all very much for coming, and thank you especially to the staff, that wonderful staff at the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, once again, who helped to make this possible this year. So thank you all, and have a good evening.